In the depths of the Great Famine, when bread became more precious than gold, the scurrying shadows in the walls held secrets that would reshape an entire economy. Hello, friends, and welcome to tonight's journey into a time long past, when the world turned upside down and the smallest creatures became the most valuable treasures. Close your eyes, settle into your pillows, and let me carry you back to the 14th century, to a place where desperation and ingenuity danced together in the flickering candlelight of medieval Europe. The year was 1315, and the rains had not stopped for what felt like an eternity. Picture, if you will, a small village nestled in the rolling hills of what we now call northern France, though borders meant little in those days beyond the reach of local lords and the sweep of their domains. The village had no grand name recorded in histories, just a cluster of timber-framed houses with thatched roofs that sagged under the constant weight of water, their walls dark with moisture that never quite dried. The central square, usually packed hard by the feet of merchants and farmers, had become a shallow lake of churning mud that sucked at wooden clogs and bare feet alike. This village, like thousands of others scattered across the continent, was about to discover that survival required reimagining everything they thought they knew about value itself. In better times, the village had thrived on the rhythm of the seasons, that ancient pulse that governed all rural life. Spring brought plowing and planting, summer meant tending and hopping, autumn delivered the harvest that would sustain them through winter's cold embrace, and then the cycle would begin anew. But these were not better times. The spring of 1315 had arrived with unprecedented rainfall that turned fields into bogs where seeds rotted before they could sprout. The summer that followed brought no respite, only more gray skies weeping endlessly upon the earth. Farmers stood at the edges of their fields, watching helplessly as their crops drowned, as fungus and blight spread through what little managed to grow, as the very soil seemed to dissolve into useless muck beneath their feet. By autumn, there was almost nothing to harvest, and the winter that approached promised to be merciless to those with empty granaries and depleted stores. The village baker, a man named Aldrich who had inherited his trade from his father and his father before him, found himself in an impossible position as the famine deepened. His bakehouse, a stone structure that had stood for 3 generations, had always been the heart of the village, the source of the dark rye bread that formed the foundation of every meal. The familiar aroma of baking loaves had marked the passage of each day as reliably as the church bells. But now, his stores of grain had dwindled to almost nothing, and what remained commanded prices that made even wealthy merchants blanch. A single loaf of bread, the kind that would have cost a penny in normal times, now required a week's wages for those fortunate enough to still have work. Aldrich measured out his remaining flour with trembling hands, knowing that each batch he mixed might be his last, knowing that the faces of hungry children pressed against his window would multiply as the stocks continued to fall. The economic structures that had governed medieval life for centuries began to collapse under the weight of scarcity. The carefully maintained hierarchies, the systems of obligation and exchange that bound lord to vassal and master to apprentice, all of it started to fray when the most basic necessity became unavailable at any price. Coins, whether silver pennies or copper farthings, retained their metallic worth but lost their practical utility when there was simply nothing to purchase. A merchant might possess a purse heavy with currency, but no amount of money could conjure food from empty fields or summon grain from depleted warehouses. This was the terrible mathematics of famine. When supply approaches zero, price becomes infinite and money becomes meaningless. In the early months of the crisis, before the true depth of the catastrophe became apparent, the lord of the region, Baron Thibault, had attempted to manage the situation through traditional means. He imposed price controls, forbidding merchants and farmers from charging more than the customary rates for their goods. He opened his own stores to provide relief, distributing grain from his reserves to prevent complete chaos in his domain. He sent riders to neighboring territories, seeking to purchase whatever surplus might be available, offering increasingly desperate terms of trade. But these measures, well-intentioned as they might have been, could not address the fundamental problem. There simply was not enough food. The price controls merely ensured that what little existed disappeared from open markets, hoarded by those lucky enough to possess it. The baron's stores, generous though they were, could not feed an entire region for more than a few weeks. And the neighboring territories, suffering under the same endless rains, had nothing to spare and much to fear themselves. It was in this context of cascading failure, when the old systems proved inadequate to the moment, that people began to notice something curious. While crops rotted in the fields and livestock perished from disease and hunger, while stored grain molded in damp granaries and preserved meats turned rancid in barrels that could not be kept dry, one population seemed to be thriving: the rats. These small, adaptable creatures, despised in good times as vermin and spreaders of disease, had found paradise in the chaos of famine. They thrived in the damp conditions, multiplying rapidly, feeding on the spoiled grain and contaminated stores that humans could no longer consume. Their populations exploded, their sleek brown and gray bodies becoming an increasingly common sight in every barn, every cellar, every dark corner of human habitation. At first, the proliferation of rats was simply another misery to add to the growing list. They consumed what little remained, contaminated stores with their droppings. Their incessant gnawing could be heard through thin walls at all hours. Mothers lay awake at night, listening to them scurrying above the rafters, worrying that they might approach the cradles where hungry bobbies whimpered for milk that breasts could no longer produce. Aldrich the baker spent his evenings setting traps around his precious remaining flour, knowing that a family of rats could devastate his inventory in a single night. The rats seemed to mock their human neighbors, fat and glossy while children grew thin, multiplying while families shrank, thriving in conditions that brought only suffering to those who had built the villages and farms they now infested. But hunger has a way of transforming perspective, of revealing value in unexpected places. The first person to eat rat meat in desperation, whose name is lost to history, probably did so with shame and revulsion. Rats were unclean creatures, associated with filth and disease, certainly not fit food for Christians who prided themselves on maintaining certain standards even in hardship. Yet that unknown pioneer discovered something that would spread rapidly throughout the starving territories. Rat meat, while certainly not pleasant, was edible, and more importantly, it was available. A rat, properly skinned and cooked thoroughly over a fire, could provide a small but meaningful amount of protein. A family might catch 3 or 4 in a night using simple traps, enough to make a thin stew that, while revolting to contemplate in normal times, could keep them alive for another day. The transition from eating rats out of desperation to actively hunting them as a food source happened with remarkable speed once the initial taboo was broken. Men who had hunted deer and boar in the forests surrounding the village now turned their skills to tracking the rats that infested their own homes. Traps became increasingly sophisticated as craftsmen applied their ingenuity to the problem of catching as many of these small, quick creatures as possible. Children, their bellies tight with hunger, learned to move quietly through barns and storage buildings, spotting the telltale signs of rat nests and runs. The evening catch of rats became a measure of a family's fortune for the day, counted and compared with the same attention that had once been devoted to the harvest yield or the health of livestock. It was Aldrich the baker who first conceived of rats as something more than mere food, who saw in them the potential for a new kind of economic exchange. The thought came to him one evening as he sat in his bakehouse, which had become painfully quiet since he had so little baking to do. He had been approached earlier that day by a farmer named Godfrey, a decent man with a wife and 4 children, who had come seeking bread. Godfrey had no money, his savings long since spent on the inflated prices of the early famine, but he had offered to trade work for food. "I'll repair your roof," Godfrey had said, gesturing at the thatch that had begun to leak in several places. "I'll chop wood for your oven. I'll do whatever you need. Just please, a loaf for my family." Aldrich had wanted to help, his heart aching at the hollowness in Godfrey's eyes, but he had so little flour remaining that he could not afford to part with a full loaf in exchange for labor he did not need. The farmer had left empty-handed, and Aldrich had spent the rest of the day feeling the weight of guilt and helplessness. But that evening, as he sat contemplating his dwindling stores and watching 3 fat rats that had grown bold enough to venture near his workspace, an idea began to form. He had flour, precious and irreplaceable, but he also had an oven that still worked, fuel for the fire, and most importantly, the skill to transform ingredients into bread. What if, he wondered, people could bring him rats which were abundant, and he could process them into something more palatable, more useful than a simple roasted rodent? The rats contained fat, which could be rendered and used in cooking. Their meat, while lean and tough, could be ground and mixed with what little grain he had, extending his supplies and creating a more substantial product. Their bones could be boiled for broth, providing the base for soups and stews. Their pelts, small though they were, could potentially be dried and used. Enough of them stitched together might even create a garment, though that seemed far-fetched even in his desperate imagination. The more Aldrich considered the idea, the more it took shape in his mind. He could establish an exchange rate, a set number of rats for a small loaf of his extended bread, or for a portion of rendered fat, or for a cup of bone broth. People would have an incentive to catch rats, which would simultaneously provide them with a means of obtaining food and reduce the rat population that was causing so many problems. He would benefit by extending his remaining grain supplies and maintaining his role as a central figure in the village economy, rather than simply waiting helplessly for his stocks to run out completely. It was a wild idea, certainly nothing like the traditional economics of grain prices and daily wages that had governed his trade for his entire life. But these were not traditional times, and desperate circumstances demanded innovative solutions. The next morning, Aldrich opened his bakehouse earlier than usual, despite having no baking to do, and posted a sign that he had carefully lettered the night before. The sign announced his new exchange system. 5 rats, dead and in decent condition, could be traded for a small loaf of bread made from his extended recipe. 10 rats could be exchanged for a cup of rendered rat fat, useful for cooking or as a spread. 20 rats would purchase a large container of bone broth, concentrated and nutritious. The rates were arbitrary, based more on intuition than any real calculation, but they represented a starting point, a framework for exchange in a situation where normal frameworks had utterly failed. The initial reactions to Aldrich's proposal ranged from skepticism to desperate interest. Some villagers were offended by the very idea, seeing it as a degradation of human dignity to formalize the eating of vermin in such an explicit way. "We're not animals ourselves," one elderly woman declared loudly in the square, "to be trading in rats like they're proper goods." Others saw opportunity immediately, calculating how many rats they might be able to catch and what provisions they could obtain in exchange. Godfrey the farmer, the same man who had sought bread the day before, appeared at Aldrich's door that afternoon with a sack containing 7 dead rats, carefully killed and still fresh. "Will you take these?" he asked, hope and embarrassment warring in his voice. Aldrich examined them, nodded, and measured out flour to create a loaf and a half according to his posted rates. As Godfrey walked away with his bread, clutching it like the precious thing it was, Aldrich saw others watching from doorways and windows, making their own calculations about this new economy. Within a week, the rat trade had become established practice in the village. Families who had been barely surviving found purpose in hunting the abundant rodents, and the exchange gave them access to prepared food that, while still desperately meager, was better than anything they could create on their own. Aldrich's bakehouse became a bustling center of activity again, though not in the way anyone would have imagined just a month earlier. Instead of purchasing bread with coins, people arrived with sacks and baskets of rats, their catches displayed with a strange mixture of pride and disgust. Aldrich, for his part, became extraordinarily efficient at processing his unusual raw material, developing techniques to quickly skin and butcher the small carcasses, render the fat in large pots over his oven, and mix the ground meat into his bread dough, extending it enough to feed more people while maintaining at least some nutritional value. The system that Aldrich had improvised began to develop complexity as more people participated in it, and as they discovered the various uses for rats beyond immediate consumption. A woman named Beatrice, who had some skill with leather working, approached Aldrich with a proposal. She would take the rat pelts that he was currently discarding and process them into usable leather. The pelts were small, but stitched together they could create items of value: pouches, patches for clothing, even crude gloves if enough pelts were accumulated. She offered to give Aldrich a share of her finished products in exchange for the pelts, creating a secondary market. He agreed, happy to see his waste stream become another person's resource, and Beatrice soon had her own small operation, trading finished leather goods for more rats, which she would then skin herself, selling the meat to Aldrich and keeping the pelts for her own work. As word of the rat economy spread to neighboring villages and farms, people began arriving from miles around, bringing their catches to trade. The standardization that Aldrich had begun with his simple exchange rates started to spread and evolve. A merchant named Philippe, who had previously dealt in wool and cloth, saw opportunity in systematizing the rat trade. He began traveling between villages, buying rats in places where they were most abundant, and selling them in places where Aldrich's processing services were in highest demand. He established more refined quality standards. Rats had to be recently killed, undamaged, of a certain minimum size. He created different price tiers based on the quality and size of the animals, with large, healthy rats commanding premium rates while smaller or damaged specimens were worth less. Philippe even began extending credit of a sort, advancing bread to trusted individuals against their promise to deliver a certain number of rats over the coming days, essentially creating a futures market in rodents. The formalization of rat-based exchange created some surprisingly sophisticated economic dynamics. People began specializing based on their particular advantages and skills. Young boys, quick and agile, could chase rats through tight spaces and became expert trappers, trading their catches to feed their families. Men who had been soldiers or hunters adapted their skills, creating elaborate trap systems that could catch multiple rats simultaneously, becoming the equivalent of wealthy producers in this new economy. Women who had experience in food preparation found employment helping Aldrich and others process the constant stream of rodents, earning their keep by doing work that, while unpleasant, was necessary and valued. Even the elderly and infirm could contribute by watching trap lines, collecting catches, or performing simple processing tasks, maintaining their dignity and their ability to feed themselves when the traditional economy would have left them completely dependent on charity. The psychological shift required to embrace this new reality was profound and happened at different rates for different people. For children growing up during the famine, rats as food and currency became normalized with remarkable speed. They had no strong memories of times when such things would have been unthinkable, and they adapted with the flexibility of youth, learning to trap and hunt rats with the same enthusiasm that children in better times might have applied to games or apprenticing in respected trades. Adults struggled more, particularly those old enough to remember when the village had prospered, when markets had offered proper meat and fresh bread, when the sight of a rat had provoked only disgust and the urge to kill it as a pest rather than as a resource. Yet necessity has a way of reshaping perception, And as the famine wore on with no sign of relief, even the most reluctant participants found themselves counting their rat catches and calculating their worth according to the new standards. Baron Thibault, observing the spontaneous development of this rat economy from his manor house on the hill overlooking the village, faced a decision about how to respond. On one hand, the whole system seemed to make a mockery of proper social order, of the careful hierarchies and traditional practices that were supposed to govern economic life. Rats as currency. It was absurd, undignified, a sign of how far his domain had fallen from the prosperity he had inherited. On the other hand, it was working. The rat trade had stabilized a situation that had been rapidly spiraling toward complete chaos. People who had been on the edge of starvation now had a means of obtaining food. The system had emerged organically from the desperate ingenuity of his subjects, and attempting to suppress it might trigger exactly the kind of social breakdown he feared most. The Baron consulted with his steward and his chaplain, both of whom offered conflicting advice, but ultimately he made a practical decision. He would not only permit the rat economy but would participate in it, legitimizing it through his involvement. The Baron's participation transformed the rat trade from a desperate improvisation into something approaching an official system. He announced that taxes could be paid in rats at established exchange rates, converting rodents into a form of currency recognized by the feudal authority itself. He opened his own processing facilities, employing villagers to skin, butcher, and preserve rats on a larger scale than Aldrich's bakehouse could manage. Most significantly, he established the Baron's storehouse, where rats could be deposited and certificates issued that could then be traded like promissory notes. A farmer who caught 50 rats but didn't need food immediately could deposit them at the storehouse and receive a certificate stating his credit, which he could later redeem for processed food, or use to pay debts, or even trade to others. This innovation created something remarkably similar to paper money, backed not by precious metal, but by the ubiquitous vermin that infested every building and field. The development of rat certificates as a tradable instrument added a new layer of sophistication to the economy. Suddenly, people were not just catching rats for immediate sustenance, but as a form of savings, a hedge against future hunger. The certificates could be accumulated, their value relatively stable because rats remained abundant even as other food sources failed completely. A shrewd trader might accept rat certificates as payment for goods or services, knowing they could be redeemed later for actual food. Debts that had been denominated in silver pennies were renegotiated and settled with rat certificates, creating a functioning credit system when the traditional monetary economy had effectively frozen. The Baron's decision to accept taxes in rats meant that the certificates had real backing and enforceability, making them as trusted as any coinage had been in the past. Not everyone adapted well to the new system, of course. Some villagers, particularly those with strong religious objections to eating what they considered unclean animals, resisted participating even as they grew desperately hungry. Father Benedict, the village priest, wrestled with the theological implications. The Bible offered little specific guidance on eating rats, though there were certainly passages about unclean animals that could be interpreted as prohibiting their consumption. Yet faced with parishioners who were starving, who came to him seeking spiritual comfort but also practical advice on how to survive, he found himself in an impossible position. Could he condemn practices that kept his flock alive? Could he insist on religious purity when the alternative was death? After much prayer and consultation with his own religious superiors, who were facing similar questions throughout the region, Father Benedict arrived at a pragmatic theological position. In times of extreme necessity, when no other food was available, the consumption of otherwise forbidden things was permissible as the lesser of evils, the preservation of life taking precedence over dietary laws. His announcement from the pulpit, delivered with obvious difficulty and many caveats, nonetheless gave permission to those who had been holding back, allowing them to participate in the rat economy without feeling they were imperiling their immortal souls. The social dynamics within the village shifted in unexpected ways as the rat economy matured. Traditional markers of status and wealth became less relevant when survival itself was the primary concern. A lord's son who was incompetent at catching rats might find himself going hungry, while a farmer's daughter with quick hands and sharp eyes became relatively prosperous. The hierarchies didn't disappear entirely, of course. The baron still commanded authority and resources beyond any commoner, and the better-off families still had advantages of property and connections. But the rat economy created opportunities for individual initiative and skill that the rigid traditional system had not allowed, introducing a measure of social mobility, however grim the circumstances that produced it. There were, inevitably, problems and abuses within the system. Some people tried to pass off sick or diseased rats, hoping that processors wouldn't notice until after the exchange was complete. Quality control became a significant issue, with disputes arising over whether particular specimens met the standards for trade. The baron established an inspection system, training certain trusted individuals to evaluate rat catches and certify their quality, creating yet another layer of employment and specialization. There were also incidents of theft, with some desperate individuals stealing trap lines or raiding others' catches, leading to the need for enforcement and punishment. The baron's justice, which had once dealt primarily with matters of property disputes and petty crimes of the traditional sort, now found itself adjudicating cases centered on rats, ownership disputes, quality complaints, fraud allegations involving attempts to inflate weight by adding stones to sacks of rats or concealing damaged specimens among good ones. As months passed and the rat economy became the established normal, people began to lose sight of how extraordinary the transformation had been. Children who asked their parents about the old money received confused explanations about shiny metal pieces that could be exchanged for food, a concept that seemed abstract and bizarre compared to the immediate, tangible value of rats. The elderly, meanwhile, found themselves serving as living memory of how things had once been, telling stories that increasingly seemed like fairy tales to younger listeners. We used to throw rats away. One grandmother might say to her wide-eyed grandchildren. We considered them worthless pests. Can you imagine? We actually paid people to kill them and then just discarded the bodies. The children would laugh at such obvious exaggeration, unable to conceive of a world where something as valuable as a rat would be treated so carelessly. The rat economy created unexpected cultural changes as well. Expertise in trapping and processing rats became a point of pride, with people sharing techniques and competing to show off their catches. Songs developed, darkly humorous verses about the hunting of rats and the strange world the famine had created. Silver had a shine, gold had a glow, but now the greatest treasure is what scurries down below, went one popular refrain, sung in taverns where ale had long since run out but people still gathered for companionship. Children's games incorporated rat hunting, with mock traps and imaginary catches replacing the tag and ball games of better times. The language itself evolved, with new terms and expressions entering common usage. Counting rats became a euphemism for taking inventory of one's assets. Rat-rich described someone who had abundant food, while rat-poor meant desperately hungry despite the abundance of the actual animals. The winter of 1315 gave way to a spring that brought no relief, and then to a summer as waterlogged and miserable as the one before. The rains continued their relentless assault on the land, and any hope that the famine might be a single season's aberration died along with the crops that rotted in the fields for the second year running. The rat economy, which had begun as an emergency measure, a temporary adaptation to extraordinary circumstances, became the permanent foundation of survival throughout the region. What had seemed shocking and degrading a year earlier now seemed normal, even mundane. Aldrich's bakehouse processed rats with the same routine efficiency that it had once devoted to ordinary bread making, and the steady stream of people arriving with their catches marked the hours of the day as reliably as church bells. The expansion and refinement of the rat-based economic system accelerated as it became clear this would not be a short-term situation. Philippe the merchant, who had been among the first to recognize the commercial possibilities, expanded his operations significantly. He established a network of collection points throughout the region, small stations, where people could drop off their rat catches and receive immediate credit rather than having to travel to central processing facilities. These collection points were staffed by agents who worked on commission, earning a share of the rats they accumulated. Philippe himself traveled constantly, coordinating the flow of resources, identifying areas where rats were most plentiful and directing trappers there, matching supply with demand across dozens of villages and towns. His operation became sophisticated enough that he began exporting rats to other regions where the famine was equally severe, but where organized systems for harvesting them had not yet developed, trading them for whatever other resources might be available, creating an interregional commerce in rodents that would have been unimaginable just 2 years earlier. The diversification of rat-based products continued to expand as people discovered new applications for every part of the animal. A tanner named Gregor, working with Beatrice, who had pioneered the use of rat pelts, developed a process for treating the tiny skins that made them surprisingly durable. They began producing items that went beyond mere utility: decorative pouches with intricate stitching, gloves lined with multiple layers of rat fur that actually provided decent warmth, even elaborate garments for those wealthy enough to commission them. The Baron himself was presented with a vest made from hundreds of carefully selected and matched rat pelts, dyed black and sewn with remarkable craftsmanship, which he wore under his regular clothing, appreciating the warmth even if he never admitted publicly what it was made from. The market for rat leather goods became substantial enough that it created its own economic subsector, with apprentices learning the specialized skills required to work with such small, delicate skins. The bones of rats, initially valued only for the broth they could produce, found additional applications through experimentation and necessity. Ground into meals, they could be added to bread as a calcium supplement, helping to prevent some of the nutritional deficiency diseases that plagued the population during the extended famine. A healer named Agnes discovered that rat bones could be carefully cleaned, dried, and carved into small items: buttons, needles, decorative pins, even dice for games. These bone products became another tradable commodity, another way to extract value from creatures that had once been considered worthless vermin. Agnes established a small workshop where she and several assistants processed bones in bulk, their careful work creating items that connected back to the normalcy of life before the famine, when people had cared about buttons matching their clothes or had leisure time for games of chance. The rendered fat from rats, which Aldrich had been among the first to produce and trade, developed into perhaps the most versatile product of the entire system. Beyond its obvious use in cooking, and as a spread for the increasingly creative forms of bread that bakers produced, rat fat found application in lamp oil, producing a smoky, unpleasant-smelling light, but light nonetheless in a time when proper oil was unavailable. It could be mixed with ash and herbs to create a crude but functional soap, allowing people to maintain some basic hygiene even as other amenities disappeared. Applied to leather, it provided waterproofing in an environment where everything was constantly damp. Mixed with medicinal herbs, it formed the base for salves and ointments that Agnes and other healers used to treat the various ailments that afflicted the population. The value of rendered rat fat became so significant that it commanded premium prices in the rat economy, with skilled renderers like Aldrich able to negotiate favorable exchange rates for their refined product. Baron Thibault, having committed himself to supporting and legitimizing the rat economy, became increasingly systematic in organizing its operation throughout his domain. He appointed a rat master, a newly created position that carried surprising prestige despite its unprepossessing name, responsible for coordinating all aspects of rat commerce within the barony. The first rat master was a man named Lucian, who had previously served as the baron's steward and brought administrative skills to the unusual task. Lucian established standardized measurements and grades for rats, creating a classification system that brought order to what had been somewhat chaotic exchanges. A prime rat, under Lucian's system was an adult specimen of good size, recently killed, with no damage to the pelt and a healthy appearance. Standard rats were slightly smaller or had minor imperfections, but were still fully usable. Processing rats were damaged, juvenile, or otherwise substandard specimens that could still be rendered for their basic components, but were worth significantly less. This grading system allowed for more precise pricing and reduced disputes, bringing efficiency to the market. Lucian also instituted what he called the rat census, a systematic effort to monitor rat populations throughout the barony and identify areas where they were most concentrated. Teams of census takers, usually young people with good observation skills, would survey barns, granaries, mills, and other rat-favored locations, estimating populations and reporting back to Lucian's office. This information allowed for strategic deployment of trapping efforts, directing skilled trappers to areas where their efforts would be most productive, and preventing overharvesting in areas where rat populations were beginning to decline. The census data also provided early warning of potential problems, such as disease outbreaks among rat populations that could affect both the animals' usability as food and, more frighteningly, might spread to the human population that depended on them. The concern about disease was never far from anyone's mind, despite the desperate circumstances that drove the rat economy. Everyone knew that rats could carry illness, that the Black Plague that had devastated Europe in earlier centuries had been associated with rodents, though the precise mechanisms were not understood in the medical knowledge of the time. Healers like Agnes worked to establish safety practices for handling and processing rats. Always cook the meat thoroughly. Wash hands after handling raw carcasses. Avoid rats that appeared sick or behaved strangely. Never eat rats found dead of unknown causes. These guidelines were posted at collection points and processing facilities, repeated by Father Benedict in his homilies, taught to children along with their trapping techniques. The Baron made violation of rat safety protocols a punishable offense, recognizing that a disease outbreak could devastate his already stricken domain even more thoroughly than the famine itself had done. Despite these precautions, illness was inevitable in a population weakened by prolonged malnutrition and living in close proximity to the rodents they depended upon for survival. Various ailments swept through the villages periodically: fevers, stomach complaints, skin infections, and other maladies that healers struggled to address with their limited resources. Agnes and other practitioners did their best, using such herbs as they still grew in the perpetually damp conditions, applying their knowledge of traditional remedies, and inventing new treatments when old ones proved inadequate. The rat fat-based salves proved particularly useful for treating the various skin conditions that proliferated in the damp environment, and careful nursing helped many people recover who might otherwise have perished. But the death rate remained elevated throughout the famine years, particularly among the very young and very old, those whose bodies had the least resilience to cope with malnutrition and disease together. The social fabric of the community transformed in ways both subtle and profound under the sustained pressure of the famine, and the unusual economy it had spawned. Traditional family structures began to show strain as the crisis wore on year after year. Young people who would normally have married and established their own households during this period instead remained with their parents or delayed marriages indefinitely, unable to contemplate starting families when feeding existing mouths was challenging enough. The birth rate plummeted as women's bodies, pushed to the edge of starvation, often could not sustain pregnancies or produce milk for infants. The few babies born during these years were celebrated with fierce joy, but also regarded with anxiety, each hungry mouth another challenge in a situation where resources were already stretched beyond breaking. Yet the same conditions that strained families also created new bonds and forms of cooperation. Households that had previously been largely self-sufficient now found themselves dependent on networks of exchange and mutual support. Trapping cooperatives formed, where several families would pool their resources, share trapline territories, and divide catches according to need and contribution. Processing collectives emerged around Aldrich's Bakehouse and similar facilities, with people contributing different skills. Some did the killing and skinning, others the butchering. Still others tended the fires and managed the rendering pots, and the finished products were divided among participants according to complex formulas that evolved to account for varying levels of effort and expertise. These collective arrangements provided some buffer against the worst effects of individual misfortune and spread knowledge and skills more widely through the community. The second winter of the famine, spanning from late 1316 into the early months of 1317, was particularly brutal. The rat economy that had stabilized the situation during the previous year faced new challenges as the extended cold and continued dampness began to affect even the hardy rodent population. Rats, while adaptable, were not infinite in number, and the intensive harvesting that had kept people alive throughout the famine had begun to reduce their populations in some areas. Lucian's rat census recorded declines in several key districts, and Philippe the merchant reported increasing difficulty in finding sufficient supply to meet demand. The specter that haunted everyone's nightmares began to seem terrifyingly possible. What if they ran out of rats before the famine ended? This concern prompted Baron Thibault to take a radical step that demonstrated just how completely the rat economy had been integrated into the functioning of his domain. He declared certain areas to be rat preserves, territories where trapping was temporarily forbidden to allow populations to recover and breed. These preserves were enforced by the Baron's men-at-arms, who patrolled the boundaries and punished anyone caught poaching rats from the protected zones. The decision was deeply unpopular among the desperate population, who saw abundant rats in the preserves while their own trap lines ran increasingly empty. But the Baron held firm, convinced that careful management was necessary to prevent the complete collapse of the resource they all depended upon. He supplemented this conservation effort by establishing breeding programs, setting aside buildings where rats were deliberately allowed to multiply undisturbed, their populations managed like livestock to ensure sustainable harvest levels. The concept of rat farming, of deliberately cultivating the creatures that had always been considered pests, represented perhaps the most complete inversion of normal values that the famine produced. Buildings that had once stored grain were repurposed as rat houses, with careful attention paid to providing conditions that encouraged breeding. Shelter from the worst weather, access to water, and feeding them what scraps and waste could be gathered, even including some of the otherwise inedible components of processed rats in a closed-loop system. Workers tended these rat farms with the same serious attention that farmers had once devoted to crops or livestock, learning the rhythms of rat reproduction, identifying productive breeding pairs, culling populations at sustainable rates. Young rats were allowed to mature to optimal size before harvest, while breeding stock was carefully maintained and protected. The most successful rat farmers became respected figures in the community, their expertise in managing these unlikely livestock valuable and sought after. The psychological adaptation required to treat rats as valued livestock rather than reviled pests was considerable, particularly for older generations who retained strong memories of normal times. Yet children growing up during the famine had no such adjustment to make. For them, rats had always been important, valuable, even precious in their way. Young boys swapped stories of their greatest catches with the same enthusiasm that children in better times might have discussed fishing expeditions or hunts for proper game. Girls compared the quality of rat pelts they had processed, taking pride in their skill at producing the most uniform, unblemished skins. The shift in attitudes was so complete that some worried about what would happen when the famine finally ended, whether children raised in this system would be able to readjust to normal values, whether the habits and mindsets formed during these years would persist even when they were no longer necessary. Father Benedict wrestled with these questions in his role as spiritual shepherd to the community, trying to maintain some connection to the moral and ethical frameworks that had governed life before the crisis, while also acknowledging the strange new realities they all inhabited. His homilies during this period were fascinating documents, preserved in his own careful handwriting in the parish records. He spoke of how God tested his people, how suffering could be redemptive if endured with faith and mutual charity, how the creative adaptation they had shown in developing the rat economy might itself be seen as a manifestation of divine providence, God providing for his people through unlikely means. He struggled to articulate a theology that could encompass their situation, that could find meaning and dignity in circumstances that seemed to strip away so much of what had made life worth living. His greatest challenge, he confided in his private journal, was maintaining his own faith when faced with the suffering of innocents, the cries of hungry children, the steady accumulation of deaths that continued despite all their desperate efforts at adaptation and survival. The cultural production of the famine years reflected the strange new normal that had emerged. The songs and stories that people created and shared dealt extensively with rats, sometimes humorously, sometimes grimly, always acknowledging the central role these creatures now played in everyone's life. The Ballad of the Rat Catcher became particularly popular, a lengthy narrative song that told of a legendary trapper who supposedly caught 1,000 rats in a single night through a combination of skill, cunning, and supernatural assistance. Whether based on any real person or purely fictional, the ballad served as entertainment and also as a repository of actual trapping knowledge, its verses encoding practical information about rat behavior and effective techniques for catching them. Children learned the ballad by heart, and in doing so absorbed wisdom that would serve them in their own trapping efforts. Visual arts during this period, limited though they were by the scarcity of materials, also reflected the rat-centered reality. A talented young woman named Margaret, who had some training in illustration and illumination, began creating small drawings and paintings on whatever surfaces she could find. Pieces of wood, bits of leather, even the walls of buildings when invited to do so. Her work depicted scenes from daily life in the famine, and rats featured prominently. Rats being trapped, rats being processed, rats in their role as the strange currency that kept society functioning. Margaret's most famous piece, commissioned by Baron Thibault himself, was a large painting on a wooden panel that showed the village square filled with people going about their business, and every transaction, every exchange, somehow involved rats. The painting was both documentary and satirical, capturing the absurdity of their situation while also honoring the ingenuity and determination that had allowed them to survive. As the second full year of the famine progressed through 1317, subtle signs began to emerge that conditions might finally be changing. The rains, while still frequent, were no longer quite so constant and overwhelming. There were days and then stretches of days when the sun actually appeared, wan and tentative at first but gradually gaining strength. Farmers, ever alert to the possibility of planting, began to test their fields, finding that the soil, while still sodden, was beginning to drain. The possibility of a harvest, an actual harvest of real crops, began to seem imaginable for the first time in years. Hope, that dangerous emotion that everyone had learned to guard against during the long crisis, began to stir in hearts that had become accustomed to despair. Yet even as conditions potentially improved, the rat economy continued to function and even expand. The systems that had been developed over 2 years of crisis had become sophisticated and deeply embedded in how the community operated. The infrastructure was in place. The knowledge and skills had been developed and distributed. The social practices and norms had been established. When farmers did begin to plant again, taking advantage of the gradually improving weather, they discovered that they could finance their planting operations by intensifying their rat trapping, using rat certificates to purchase seed and tools, effectively borrowing against their catches to invest in the possibility of a real harvest. The rat economy had become flexible enough to support the transition back toward normalcy. Rather than simply being abandoned the moment, other food sources became available. The summer of 1317 brought a modest but real harvest, the first in 3 years. The joy and relief were profound, tears streaming down weathered faces as people brought in grain that they had grown themselves, that came from proper fields rather than from the bodies of scavenging rodents. But the harvest, while cause for celebration, was not abundant enough to immediately replace the rat economy that had sustained them for so long. Crops that had struggled to establish themselves in still difficult conditions produced yields far below normal levels. The grain that was harvested had to be carefully allocated, saved for seed for the next planting, reserved against the possibility that conditions might worsen again. People could not simply return to pre-famine patterns of consumption when stores remained perilously low and the future uncertain. This transitional period created interesting economic dynamics as two systems operated simultaneously. The traditional grain-based economy that people remembered and longed to return to, and the rat-based economy that had actually kept them alive, and that still provided a significant portion of their sustenance, and served as a medium of exchange. Exchange rates developed between the two. How many rats equaled a bushel of grain, how rat certificates could be converted into grain-based currency, how debts denominated in one system could be settled in the other. Philippe the merchant, ever alert to opportunity, positioned himself as a broker between the two economies, facilitating conversions and taking a small percentage for his services. The dual economy period proved complex but manageable, a gradual transition rather than an abrupt shift, allowing people to maintain the survival strategies that had served them while slowly rebuilding the more normal patterns they had lost. Baron Thibault faced important decisions about how to manage this transition period and what role rat-based economic activity should continue to play in his domain going forward. Some advisors argued that the rat economy should be rapidly wound down, that its continued existence was undignified and represented a shameful period best left behind as quickly as possible. Others, including Lucian the Rat Master, argued that the systems developed during the famine had proven remarkably effective and might have value even in normal times. After all, rats remained pests that caused damage to stored grain and property. Having an organized system for controlling their populations while also extracting some value from them made practical sense regardless of whether famine conditions persisted. The debate reflected deeper questions about what lessons should be learned from the crisis and how society should adapt to the recognition that circumstances could arise that rendered traditional systems inadequate. The Baron's eventual decision was characteristically pragmatic. He maintained the basic infrastructure of the rat economy, but scaled it back significantly as other food sources became more available. The rat preserves and breeding programs were discontinued, allowing populations to be harvested more freely. The collection points and processing facilities remained operational but at reduced capacity, available for those who still needed them while not commanding the central role they had during the height of the famine. The rat certificates continued to be honored and could still be used to pay certain taxes and fees, though they were no longer the primary medium of exchange. This measured approach allowed for gradual transition while preserving institutional knowledge and capacity that might prove valuable if another crisis arose. As 1318 dawned and conditions continued to improve, bringing hope for a much better harvest that year, people began to reflect on the extraordinary period they had endured and what it had meant. The famine, with all its horrors and deprivations, had killed thousands throughout the region, separated families, destroyed wealth and property, and left scars both physical and psychological that would persist for generations. Yet it had also revealed capacities for adaptation, innovation, and mutual support that might never have been discovered in easier times. The rat economy, bizarre and disturbing as it was, had represented genuine ingenuity, the ability of people facing impossible circumstances to imagine new solutions, to question assumptions about value and worth, to cooperate in creating systems that kept their communities functioning when traditional structures had failed. The stories told about the famine years, in the decades and centuries that followed, tended to focus either on the suffering or on the strange fact of rats as currency, treating it as a curiosity, a peculiar historical oddity that demonstrated how desperate people had become. But those who had lived through it understood something more complex, that the rat economy had not been simply a desperate expedient, but a functioning alternative system that had demonstrated principles that might apply more broadly. It had shown that value was not intrinsic to objects, but was created by scarcity, need, and collective agreement. It had demonstrated that economic systems could be created and modified rapidly when circumstances demanded it, that innovation could come from the bottom up rather than being imposed from above. It had proven that cooperation and systematic organization could create value and efficiency, even when dealing with the most unpromising resources. For Aldrich the baker, who had been among the first to conceptualize rats as something that could be systematically exchanged, the famine years had been transformative. He had gone from being a skilled craftsman working within a traditional trade to becoming an entrepreneur and innovator who had helped create an entirely new economic system. As conditions normalized and his bakehouse gradually returned to producing ordinary bread from grain flour, he found himself reflecting on what the experience had taught him about value, about systems, about human adaptability. He had seen how quickly the seemingly fixed structures of economy and society could dissolve when fundamental assumptions about scarcity changed, and how quickly new structures could emerge to replace them. He had learned that his skills as a baker translated into abilities that went beyond simply making bread, that process management, quality control, and systematic production applied equally whether he was working with grain or with rodents. Godfrey the farmer, the man who had been among the first to bring rats to Aldrich's bakehouse in exchange for bread, also carried lessons forward from the famine years. He had learned that value could be created from what others overlooked or despised, that attention and effort applied to abundant resources could provide sustenance when traditional sources failed. As he worked to rebuild his farm and restore his fields to productivity during the recovery years, he maintained a few trap lines and continued to collect rats, not because he needed them for food anymore, but because they remained pests that damaged his stored grain. He would occasionally bring his catches to what remained of the rat processing facilities, receiving modest payment, and the activity connected him to a period when his trapping skills had been the difference between survival and starvation for his family. His children, growing up with memories of the famine years, would never take food security for granted, never assume that the systems they grew up with were permanent or unchangeable. Beatrice, the leather worker, whose skill with rat pelts had created a new trade, continued her work even as demand declined with the famine's end. She had discovered that the techniques she had developed for working with tiny, delicate rat skins had made her extraordinarily skilled at fine leather work generally. She began producing high-quality goods from conventional leather, but she maintained her rat pelt work as a specialty, creating decorative items that served as mementos of the famine years. Wealthy individuals who had survived the crisis sometimes commissioned elaborate rat pelt items as personal reminders of what they had endured, objects that embodied survival and adaptation. Beatrice's workshop became known for these unique pieces, and she trained apprentices in both conventional leather work and the specialized techniques for rat pelts, preserving skills that had been born of desperate necessity, but that retained value even in better times. Philippe the merchant experienced perhaps the most straightforward translation of his famine-era activities into ongoing prosperity. The networks he had built for rat commerce, the collection systems, the quality control procedures, the credit mechanisms, all of these proved readily adaptable to normal trade goods as they became available again. He had learned during the famine how to organize complex supply chains, how to match supply with demand across geographical areas, how to extend credit and manage risk. These skills made him highly effective in the recovering economy, and his business flourished in the years following the famine. He maintained a small continuing operation in rat commerce, never entirely abandoning the trade that had been his breakthrough, but it became a minor sideline to his main activities in grain, wool, and other conventional goods. His success became a local legend, the merchant who had seen opportunity in rodents and parlayed it into lasting wealth. Lucien, the Baron's rat master, faced an uncertain future as the famine ended, and his peculiar office became less relevant. Baron Thibault, recognizing the administrative skills that Lucien had demonstrated in managing the rat economy, appointed him as general steward with responsibility for economic coordination throughout the domain. Lucien brought to this role the systematic approach and attention to detail that had served him well as rat master: careful record keeping, population monitoring, quality standards, strategic resource allocation. He occasionally reflected, with some amusement, that his experience managing rat populations and rat commerce had provided better training for general administration than any conventional preparation might have offered. The problems were ultimately similar: matching supply with demand, maintaining standards, preventing fraud and abuse, coordinating activities across dispersed locations, whether one was dealing with rats or any other resource. Baron Thibault himself was perhaps changed most profoundly by the famine years and the extraordinary economic system that had emerged in his domain. He had begun the crisis as a conventional feudal lord, expecting to manage it through traditional means, opening his stores, imposing price controls, maintaining order through established hierarchies. The complete failure of these traditional approaches had forced him to adapt, to accept and eventually embrace innovations that came from his subjects rather than from his own authority. He had learned, humility being one of the hard teachers of the famine, that wisdom and ingenuity could emerge from anywhere, that the desperate baker who had started trading bread for rats had understood the situation better than any noble advisor. This lesson stayed with him in the years that followed, making him more open to listening to unusual ideas, more willing to support innovation and experimentation, less certain that traditional ways were necessarily best simply because they were traditional. The recovery period stretched across several years, with harvests gradually improving as weather patterns returned to more normal conditions. By 1320, 5 years after the rains had first begun to fall with such unrelenting persistence, the region had largely returned to pre-famine economic patterns and levels of prosperity. The rat economy had dwindled to insignificance, a curiosity maintained in small scale by a few specialists, but no longer central to anyone's survival or to the overall functioning of commerce. Yet traces of those strange years persisted in unexpected ways, woven into the fabric of how people thought about value, about money, about economic systems. The language retained expressions coined during the famine years. Counting rats continued to mean taking stock of one's resources, even when the resources in question were entirely conventional. Not worth a rat became a common expression for something valueless, the irony being that during the famine, rats had been extraordinarily valuable, so the phrase actually inverted over time. Rich as a rat lord emerged as a description of ostentatious wealth, the term combining the memory of rat-based prosperity with mockery of pretensions. These linguistic fossils preserved memories of a period that people preferred not to dwell on, but that had nonetheless shaped their collective consciousness. The physical infrastructure of the rat economy largely disappeared as it became unnecessary, and as people tried to put the famine years behind them. The collection points were repurposed or dismantled, the processing facilities converted to other uses or allowed to decay, the breeding buildings returned to their original purposes as storage or housing. Yet some traces remained visible for those who knew what to look for. Trap-mounting holes drilled in barn beams, rendering pot stains on stone floors, modifications to buildings that had been adapted for rat-related activities. These remnants, mostly unnoticed by later generations, were like archaeological artifacts of the famine economy, physical evidence of how thoroughly the crisis had transformed daily life and physical space. Father Benedict, who had wrestled so painfully with the theological and moral dimensions of the famine and the rat economy, produced during the recovery years a remarkable document that he titled Reflections on Providence, Necessity, and the Transformation of Value in Times of Crisis. This work, part memoir, part theological treatise, part economic analysis, attempted to make sense of what the community had experienced and endured. He argued that the famine had revealed fundamental truths about the nature of value, showing that worth was not inherent in objects, but was created through scarcity and utility in context. He explored the moral questions raised by practices that would have been unthinkable in normal times, but that had been necessary for survival. developing a framework for understanding how ethical principles must adapt to extraordinary circumstances, while maintaining core values of human dignity and mutual care. His work circulated among educated clergy and scholars in the region, contributing to broader discussions about economic theory and moral theology that were beginning to emerge as Europe slowly recovered from the period of crisis. The generations that followed carried forward memories of the famine years in ways both conscious and unconscious. The strange time when rats became currency, leaving marks that would persist long after the last person who had lived through it had died. The children who had grown up trapping rats and trading them for bread became adults who told their own children stories that seemed increasingly fantastical with each passing year. "We hunted rats for food," they would say, and their children would shudder with disgust, unable to imagine such desperation. The Baron himself accepted rats as payment for taxes, they would add, and their children would laugh, certain this must be exaggeration or jest, because how could such an absurd thing possibly be true? Yet the records existed, preserved in the careful accounting books that Lucian and his assistants had maintained during his tenure as rat master. These ledgers, stored in the Baron's archives, documented in meticulous detail the flow of rat commerce through the domain, daily tallies of rats received at collection points, quality grades assigned to different catches, exchange rates between rats and various goods, tax payments made in rodent currency, breeding program statistics from the rat farms. Later historians, discovering these records decades and centuries after the events, would initially suspect forgery or error, finding it nearly impossible to believe that an entire regional economy had truly operated on such a basis. Only the consistent detail across multiple independent sources, the corroborating evidence from church records and merchant accounts, eventually convinced scholars that these extraordinary events had actually occurred as documented. The famine years and the rat economy became embedded in local folklore and tradition in ways that sometimes obscured and sometimes illuminated what had actually happened. An annual festival developed, celebrated on the anniversary of the first harvest after the famine, which became known as the Festival of Plenty. The festival included rituals and performances that referenced the hard times, but these references became increasingly stylized and symbolic over time. Young people would perform a dance called the Rat Catcher's Reel, involving elaborate choreography with props representing traps and catches. But the dance had become entertainment rather than any accurate depiction of the desperate work it symbolized. Vendors would sell sweet pastries shaped like rats, a darkly humorous inversion that would have been unthinkable during the actual famine, transforming the source of survival into a confection for children to enjoy. The economic theories and practices that had emerged during the famine left intellectual legacies that extended far beyond the immediate region. Scholars who studied the period found in it evidence for various arguments about the nature of money and value. Some pointed to the rat economy as proof that currency could be based on anything people agreed had value, that the backing for money need not be precious metal, but could theoretically be any scarce resource. Others saw in it a demonstration of how markets could spontaneously organize and create efficient systems for allocating resources, even in extreme conditions, without centralized planning. Still others focused on the role that Baron Thibault's intervention had played in systematizing and legitimizing the rat trade, arguing that successful monetary systems required governmental backing and enforcement, regardless of what physical commodity served as the basis for exchange. A merchant's manual written in the mid-14th century, some decades after the famine, included a chapter titled On Extraordinary Commerce in Times of Crisis that drew explicitly on the rat economy as a case study. The author, who had collected accounts from survivors and studied the preserved records, attempted to extract general principles that might apply to other crisis situations. He identified several key factors that had made the rat economy functional: the abundance of the resource serving as currency, the establishment of quality standards and enforcement mechanisms, the development of infrastructure for collection and processing, the creation of instruments like the rat certificates that allowed for more sophisticated transactions, and crucially, the acceptance and participation of governmental authority in legitimizing the system. The manual advised merchants to remain alert to similar opportunities in future crises, to be willing to think creatively about what might serve as currency or valuable good when normal systems failed, and to move quickly to establish the organizational structures that could turn desperate improvisation into systematic commerce. In the village itself, now recovering and growing during the prosperous middle decades of the 14th century, physical memorials to the famine period were few but significant. Baron Thibault, before his death in 1328, commissioned a stone monument to be erected in the village square. The monument was relatively simple, a granite pillar with inscriptions on its four faces. 3 faces listed the names of those who had died during the famine years, hundreds of names carved in small but legible letters, a memorial to suffering and loss. The 4th face bore a different sort of inscription, a relief carving that showed a rat sitting upright, surrounded by sheaves of wheat, and beneath it words in Latin that translated to, "From desperation, innovation, from crisis, community. Remember both the suffering and the survival." The monument puzzled visitors from other regions who did not know the history, but local people understood its meaning, and it became a gathering point for anniversary observations and moments of collective memory. The church where Father Benedict had delivered his conflicted homilies during the famine years received additions and renovations funded by the improving prosperity of the post-famine period. Among these additions was a series of small wooden panels depicting scenes from the famine, commissioned by the aging priest as a sort of visual testimony to what the community had endured. The panels, painted by Margate, who had become the region's most accomplished artist, showed images that were both stark and somehow beautiful. Emaciated figures setting traps, the bakehouse with its line of people clutching their catches, the Baron's storehouse with its stacks of rat certificates, Father Benedict himself blessing a meager meal that clearly included rat meat. These panels hung in a side chapel dedicated to prayer for those who had died during the famine, and they served as a reminder to prosperity that suffering could return. that the abundance they currently enjoyed was not guaranteed, that the ingenuity and cooperation demonstrated during the crisis should not be forgotten. Aldrich the baker lived to a remarkably old age, surviving into the late 1340s, and in his final years he became something of a local celebrity, one of the last people with clear adult memories of the famine's worst years. Young people would visit him, asking him to tell stories of how he had started the rat trade, how he had processed the creatures, what it had really been like. Aldrich would oblige, though he found it increasingly difficult to convey the reality of those times to people who had only known peace and plenty. "You have to understand," he would say, "it wasn't noble or heroic, it was just what we had to do. We were so hungry, so desperate, and the rats were there, and I realized I could do something with them. That's all it was, desperation and a small idea that somehow worked." He died in his sleep one winter night, and at his funeral Father Benedict's successor spoke of how a simple baker's creativity had saved hundreds of lives, how Aldrich represented the best of human adaptability in the face of crisis. The rat populations themselves, which had been so carefully managed during the famine years, returned to their normal role as pests once systematic harvesting declined. They remained abundant, as they always had been in agricultural communities, but they were again simply exterminated when found rather than being valued as resources. Yet some practices developed during the famine persisted in modified form. Farmers became more systematic about controlling rat populations in their granaries and fields, recognizing the economic damage they could cause, and applying some of the organizational approaches that had been developed during the famine years. Professional rat catchers emerged as a recognized trade, individuals who specialized in eliminating rats from buildings and agricultural facilities, and some of these specialists had learned their craft during the famine, though now they were paid in normal currency rather than being valued for the rats themselves. The question of what would happen if another major crisis arose, whether the lessons of the rat economy could be applied again, remained an open speculation. The famine of 1315 through 1317 was not the last crisis medieval Europe would face, though none quite matched it for duration and severity, until the Black Death struck in the mid-14th century. The plague, which killed perhaps a third of Europe's population, created different sorts of economic disruptions than the famine had, labor shortages rather than food shortages being the primary challenge. Yet some survivors of both crises noted that the adaptability and willingness to reimagine economic structures that had characterized the rat economy period served communities well in adjusting to the plague's aftermath. Places that had developed flexible economic thinking during the famine seemed better able to adjust wage structures, land tenure arrangements, and commercial practices to accommodate the radically changed circumstances that the plague created. The broader historical significance of the rat economy period extended beyond its immediate time and place, though historians have sometimes overlooked or underestimated it. The episode demonstrated that monetary systems were far more flexible and socially constructed than contemporary economic thinking acknowledged. medieval economic theory, heavily influenced by religious teaching, tended to treat money as having natural or divinely ordained characteristics, with gold and silver being the appropriate basis for currency because of their intrinsic value and stability. The rat economy showed that in practice, money was simply whatever people agreed to accept in exchange, that its value derived entirely from its utility and scarcity in specific contexts rather than from any inherent properties. This insight would take centuries to be fully integrated into economic theory, but the rat economy provided early empirical evidence for what would eventually become standard understanding of money's nature. The social mobility that had characterized the famine period, when traditional hierarchies partially dissolved and individual skill at rat catching could determine one's prosperity, left subtle long-term effects on the community structure. Families that had risen to prominence during the famine through their success in the rat economy sometimes retained elevated status afterward. Their accumulated resources and established commercial networks giving them advantages in the recovery period. Conversely, some traditionally prominent families that had struggled to adapt to the strange economy of the famine years found their position permanently diminished. The social order that reconstituted itself after the crisis was not quite the same as what had existed before. And this experience of social fluidity, of seeing that status and wealth were not as fixed as they had seemed, planted seeds that would contribute to larger social transformations in the later medieval period. Philippe the merchant's descendants became one of the region's most prominent commercial families over the following generations, their success ultimately traceable to his famine-era innovations in rat commerce. His great-grandson, writing a family history in the early 15th century, included a lengthy section on Philippe's activities during the famine, treating them with a mixture of pride and embarrassment. Pride because Philippe's ingenuity and business acumen had established the family's fortune. Embarrassment because the source of that fortune seemed so undignified in retrospect. The great-grandson attempted to emphasize the organizational and entrepreneurial aspects of what Philippe had done, framing it as an example of seeing opportunity where others saw only crisis, of having the vision and courage to create new systems when old ones failed. This attempted rehabilitation of the family's origin story reflected broader cultural ambivalence about the famine period, recognition that remarkable things had been accomplished, but discomfort with the desperate circumstances that had necessitated them. The rat certificates that had circulated as a form of currency during the famine became collectors' items in later centuries, physical artifacts of the strange economy that scholars and antiquarians sought out. Most had been redeemed and destroyed when they were no longer needed, but some had survived, tucked away in family papers or the Baron's archives, forgotten until rediscovered years later. These surviving certificates provided tangible evidence of the system, their careful handwriting documenting specific amounts and quality grades of rats, bearing official stamps and signatures that certified their validity. Museums and historical societies in later centuries would display these certificates as curiosities, explanatory plaques attempting to convey to modern viewers how extraordinary the circumstances had been that made such documents necessary and valuable. The theological and philosophical questions that Father Benedict and others had wrestled with during the famine continued to resonate in religious and intellectual discourse long after the immediate crisis passed. What did it mean that circumstances could arise that made traditional moral rules seem inadequate or inapplicable? How should one think about practices that were undertaken from necessity, but that violated normal standards of propriety or dignity? Could there be value or even virtue in adaptations that seemed degrading, if those adaptations enabled survival? These questions extended beyond the specific case of eating rats or using them as currency, touching on fundamental issues about the relationship between means and ends, about how to maintain human dignity in undignified circumstances, about whether moral principles were absolute or contextual. The debates that emerged contributed to broader intellectual movements of the late medieval and early Renaissance periods, feeding into humanist thought and eventual challenges to rigid scholastic frameworks. The artistic legacy of the famine period, while modest, included several works beyond Margot's church panels that preserved visual memory of the rat economy. A tapestry woven in the late 14th century, now held in a regional museum, depicted the village during the famine with remarkable detail. The weavers had included scenes of rat trapping, processing facilities, the barren storehouse with people queuing to exchange certificates, Father Benedict blessing a meal, and in the background, the rain falling continuously from gray skis. The tapestry served both as historical record and as moral instruction, its accompanying inscription reminding viewers to be grateful for abundance and to remember that prosperity could be fragile. Several illuminated manuscripts from the period included marginal illustrations that referenced the famine, often with darkly humorous touches. One showed a rat sitting on a throne with a crown. Another depicted monks counting rats as if they were precious jewels. A third showed Saint Peter at the gates of heaven, with a long queue of souls, each carrying sacks of rats as their earthly wealth. The linguistic evolution of terms related to the rat economy continued over the following centuries in interesting ways. Rat-rich had initially meant prosperous during the famine, then became somewhat ironic after the crisis ended, but eventually evolved into a general term for seeming wealthy while actually being poor, the memory of rats as valuable currency being forgotten while the phrase persisted. To rat away developed as a verb meaning to slowly deplete or diminish, derived from the way rats would gradually consume stores, but also referencing how rat certificates would be spent down during the famine. Ratty, as a description for shabby or worn-out conditions, likely predated the famine, but gained new associations with the famine years, carrying connotations of survival under difficult circumstances. These linguistic traces, largely unconscious to later speakers, kept alive some connection to the historical period even as specific memories faded. The recovery period had revealed another interesting economic dynamic related to the famine and rat economy: the question of debt and how obligations incurred during the crisis should be treated once conditions normalized. Many people had accumulated debts denominated in rats or rat certificates during the famine, borrowing to survive with the expectation of repaying when they could. As the economy recovered and shifted back to conventional currency, these debts had to be somehow translated and settled. Some creditors were generous, forgiving famine-era debts entirely on the grounds that they had been incurred under such extraordinary circumstances that normal collection would be inappropriate. Others insisted on repayment, converting the debts to grain or coin equivalents, using the exchange rates that had prevailed when the debts were incurred, which often resulted in ruinous obligations, given how much more valuable food had been during the famine compared to afterward. Baron Thibault eventually intervened, issuing an edict that established reasonable conversion rates for settling famine-era debts, rates that acknowledged their real value without creating impossible burdens. This intervention prevented significant social conflict and helped facilitate the transition back to normal economic relations. The educational system that developed in the region after the famine included, for several generations, explicit instruction about the crisis and the adaptations it had required. Teachers would tell the story of the rat economy, not as entertainment but as a serious lesson in several subjects simultaneously. For arithmetic, problems involving rat-to-bread exchange rates, conversion between rats and rat certificates, and calculation of trap line productivity served as practical exercises. For moral instruction, discussions of the difficult choices people had faced and the balance between maintaining dignity and ensuring survival provided rich material. For history and civics, the rat economy demonstrated how communities could respond to crises through cooperation and innovation, how leadership could emerge from unexpected sources, and how governmental authority could successfully adapt to changing circumstances. These lessons served not just to preserve memory, but to prepare young people for the possibility of future crises, to instill in them the understanding that adaptability and creativity might someday be necessary for their own survival. Godfrey the farmer, who had been among the first to bring rats to Aldrich's bakehouse, told his children and grandchildren stories of the famine years, with a particular emphasis on the importance of being alert to opportunities and willing to try new approaches. His eldest son, Martin, took these lessons to heart and became an innovator in agricultural techniques during the recovery period, experimenting with new crops and methods rather than simply following traditional practices. Martin directly credited his father's famine experience with teaching him that established ways of doing things were not sacred or unchangeable, that sometimes survival and success required willingness to try approaches that others might mock or reject. This transmission of adaptive mindset across generations, multiplied across many families, contributed to a gradual cultural shift toward greater openness to innovation and change, at least within this particular region. The question of whether the rat economy should be considered a success or a failure, a source of pride or shame, remained contested throughout the post-famine period and beyond. Those who emphasized its success pointed to the simple fact that it had worked. It had kept people alive through years when traditional food sources were unavailable. It had maintained some level of social order and economic function when complete collapse seemed imminent, and it had demonstrated remarkable human ingenuity and adaptability. Those who considered it shameful focused on what it represented about the depth of their desperation, the degrading practices they had been reduced to, and the failure of traditional institutions and systems to adequately protect them from such suffering. Both perspectives contained truth, and most people who had lived through the period held both simultaneously, proud of what they had managed to do while wishing desperately that they had never been forced to do it. Baron Thibault's decision to memorialize the famine period, rather than trying to suppress or forget it, was somewhat unusual for the time and proved culturally significant. Many communities that suffered severe crises tried to move past them as quickly as possible, avoiding reminders that triggered painful memories. The Baron's contrary approach, insisting on creating monuments and preserving records, ensuring that the story was told and retold, reflected his judgment that there were important lessons to be learned and transmitted. His perspective was influenced by Father Benedict, who had argued in their many conversations that memory, even of painful events, served an important moral and practical function, preventing people from becoming complacent during good times and providing guidance for how to respond if crisis recurred. This philosophy of remembrance helped ensure that the rat economy period was extensively documented and preserved in ways that many comparable historical episodes were not. The infrastructure projects undertaken during the recovery period included significant drainage improvements designed to prevent a recurrence of the flooding and waterlogging that had triggered the famine. Baron Thibault invested substantial resources, including levying special taxes and corvée labor obligations, to construct better drainage ditches, improve maintenance of water channels, and create systems that would disperse excess rainfall more effectively. These projects drew on observations made during the famine years about how water flowed and pooled, about which areas were most vulnerable to flooding, about what structures survived best in persistently wet conditions. The drainage system became a source of local pride. Representatives from other regions visited to study the techniques and potentially implement them in their own territories, and its success in managing subsequent periods of heavy rain validated the investment. The drainage projects represented another way that the famine experience, painful though it had been, generated knowledge and capabilities that improved conditions afterward. As the century progressed, and the generation that had experienced the famine as adults gradually died off, efforts intensified to record their testimonies before the memories were lost. A monk named Brother Anselm took on this task systematically in the late 1330s and early 1340s, traveling throughout the region to interview survivors and compile their accounts. His resulting work, Chronicles of the Great Hunger and the Economy of Necessity, preserved dozens of individual stories along with his own analysis and historical contextualization. Brother Anselm's work provided invaluable detailed information about daily life during the famine, The practical operations of the rat economy, the emotional and spiritual challenges people faced, and the various ways different individuals and families adapted to the crisis. His chronicles became a primary source for all subsequent histories of the period, and copies were made and distributed to monasteries and libraries throughout the region, ensuring that the knowledge would be preserved even if original documents were lost. The medical and public health lessons from the famine period, while limited by the constraints of medieval medical understanding, nonetheless advanced practical knowledge about nutrition, disease prevention, and crisis management. Agnes the Healer, who lived into the 1330s, trained several apprentices who carried forward both traditional healing knowledge and specific techniques developed during the famine. The rat fat-based salves that had proven effective for treating skin conditions continued to be produced and used long after the famine ended, becoming part of the standard pharmacopoeia. Protocols for safely handling and processing rats, developed to prevent disease transmission during the famine, evolved into more general hygiene practices around food handling and preparation. The recognition that thorough cooking was essential for safety when eating uncertain food sources translated into broader food safety awareness that benefited public health generally. These practical advances, emerging from desperate necessity, outlasted the crisis that spawned them. The psychological legacy of the famine extended across multiple generations in sometimes subtle ways. People who had experienced prolonged hunger as children often retained food-related anxieties into adulthood, hoarding food even during times of plenty, unable to waste even the smallest amount, feeling visceral distress at the sight of a surplus that others would have simply enjoyed. Parents who had suffered through the famine sometimes struggled to watch their own children play with food or be selective about what they ate, the waste triggering powerful emotional reactions rooted in memories of desperate scarcity. Conversely, some survivors developed a philosophy of enjoying abundance while it lasted, of celebrating food and never taking it for granted, of generosity with provisions because they understood viscerally that circumstances could change, and that sharing created social bonds that might prove essential if crisis returned. These differing psychological responses to the shared trauma created some generational tension, as children who had never known real hunger failed to understand their parents' intensity around food-related issues. The economic diversification that characterized the region's recovery owed something to lessons learned during the famine about not being overly dependent on single resources or systems. Farmers who had seen grain crops fail completely for multiple years began planting more varied crops, experimenting with different cultivars, creating redundancy that might protect them if conditions affected one crop type differently than another. Merchants developed more diversified trading networks, maintaining connections across multiple regions rather than depending heavily on specific routes or partners, having learned that disruptions could occur suddenly and catastrophically. Families tried to develop multiple income sources rather than relying entirely on a single trade or activity. The memory of how quickly primary livelihoods could disappear during a crisis encouraging this risk-spreading behavior. These adaptations made the regional economy more resilient and probably contributed to its relatively successful navigation of subsequent challenges throughout the 14th century. The Black Death, when it arrived in 1348, tested the region in ways different from but no less catastrophic than the Great Famine had done 3 decades earlier. The plague killed with terrifying speed and efficiency, and there was no creative economic adaptation that could address the fundamental problem of a disease for which no effective treatment existed. Yet the community's experience with the famine and the rat economy provided some advantages in facing this new crisis. The flexibility of thinking that had been cultivated, the willingness to abandon traditional practices when they proved inadequate, the experience of rapid institutional adaptation. All of these served the survivors well as they struggled to reorganize society in the plague's devastating aftermath. Ironically, given the role rats had played in keeping people alive during the famine, rats were among the vectors that helped spread the plague, though medieval people did not understand this connection. The rodents that had once been saviors became, unknowingly, agents of death in a grim reversal that later observers would note with dark irony. The survivors of both the famine and the plague, that unfortunate cohort who had lived through 2 apocalyptic crises within a single generation, developed a particular worldview shaped by their experiences of catastrophe and adaptation. They understood in their bones that stability was temporary, that the structures and systems people built could collapse with frightening speed, that survival often required abandoning dignity and embracing whatever worked. They also understood that human beings possessed remarkable capacities for endurance and innovation when pressed to the limit, that communities could function even in the most adverse circumstances if people cooperated and adapted. This generation, hardened by repeated trauma, but also empowered by their proven resilience, became the leaders and elders who guided the region through the difficult decades of the mid-14th century, their hard-won wisdom shaping decisions and policies in ways that probably reduced mortality and suffering, compared to regions that had not developed similar resilience. The commemoration practices that had begun with Baron Thibault's monument evolved over time into more elaborate traditions. The Festival of Plenty, which marked the end of the famine, became one of the region's most important annual observances, rivaling religious holidays in significance. By the late 14th century, the festival had developed complex rituals that preserved memory while also transforming it. A theatrical performance reenacting key moments from the famine became central to the celebration. Actors portrayed Aldrich receiving the first rats in exchange for bread, Baron Thibault establishing the official rat economy, Father Benedict wrestling with the theological implications, and finally the arrival of the first successful harvest. These performances, while increasingly stylized, transmitted historical knowledge across generations and reinforced communal identity, built around the shared experience of crisis and recovery. The regional identity that developed in the post-famine decades drew heavily on the experience of having survived and adapted together. People from this area spoke of themselves as particularly resourceful and adaptable, qualities they attributed to their collective experience of the rat economy period. This self-conception influenced how they approached subsequent challenges and opportunities, creating something of a self-fulfilling prophecy where belief in their special adaptability actually made them somewhat more adaptable in practice. When traders or travelers from the region encountered people from other areas, stories about the famine and rat economy often emerged as explanations for local character and customs, becoming part of how the region presented itself to the wider world. Whether other regions viewed these stories as evidence of admirable resilience or embarrassing desperation varied, but the narratives were definitely distinctive and memorable, giving the area a unique historical identity. Brother Anselm's chronicles, while extensive and valuable, could not capture everything about the famine period, and some aspects of the experience remained difficult to document or transmit. The emotional and psychological texture of living through extended crises, the daily grinding anxiety about survival, the moral compromises and impossible choices, the transformation in how one views the world and other people. These interior experiences were nearly impossible to convey to those who had not shared them. Survivors sometimes spoke of a fundamental loneliness in their memories, a sense that no matter how carefully they described what they had endured, people who had not been there could never truly understand. This communication gap created a certain isolation for the surviving generation, even as the broader community worked to remember and honor what they had lived through. Some survivors formed informal associations, gathering regularly to share memories and mutual understanding in ways that family members and neighbors who had not experienced the famine could never quite provide. The economic historians and theorists who studied the famine and rat economy period in subsequent centuries drew varying conclusions about its broader significance and implications. Some emphasized it as an example of market efficiency, showing how price signals and spontaneous organization could allocate even the most unpromising resources effectively when allowed to operate without excessive interference. Others focused on the crucial role of governmental intervention in legitimizing and systematizing what had begun as informal exchanges, arguing that the success of the rat economy demonstrated the necessity of institutional backing for any monetary system. Still others saw in it an example of how economic value was entirely socially constructed, that the dramatic shift from treating rats as worthless pests to treating them as precious currency revealed the arbitrary nature of all economic valuations. These debates, while abstract and academic, ensured that the rat economy period remained a subject of scholarly attention and discussion long after it had passed from living memory into history. The question of whether lessons from the rat economy period could be deliberately applied in other contexts, whether communities facing different sorts of crises might intentionally create similar alternative economic systems, received some practical experimentation. During a localized famine in a neighboring region in 1362, local authorities attempted to establish a systematic economy based on chestnuts, which remained relatively abundant while grain crops failed. They explicitly drew on documented practices from the rat economy, establishing collection points, quality standards, and exchange rates, even creating certificates that could be traded. The chestnut economy enjoyed some success, helping to mitigate the worst effects of that localized famine, though it never achieved the sophistication or complete economic dominance that the rat system had during the Great Famine. The experiment demonstrated that the underlying principles could be transferred to other contexts, though also that the specific circumstances, the particular resource, the duration and severity of the crisis, the social structures and leadership in place, significantly affected outcomes. Margaret, the artist who had documented the famine period in her paintings and had created the church panels, continued creating art into her old age in the 1360s and 1370s. Her later work increasingly reflected on themes of memory, time, and transformation. One of her final major pieces, painted on wooden panels for the Baron's Great Hall, presented a triptych showing the same village scene in 3 periods: before the famine with abundant harvests and prosperity, during the famine with rain falling and people trading rats, and after the recovery with new construction and restored abundance. The 3 panels invited viewers to contemplate the impermanence of any particular state of affairs, the cycles of prosperity and crisis, and the resilience of human communities across changing circumstances. Margaret wrote in her notes about this work that she wanted viewers to understand that the middle panel, the famine time, was neither an aberration nor the true state of things, but rather one phase in an ongoing cycle, no more or less real than the prosperity that preceded and followed it. The linguistic and cultural traces of the rat economy period proved remarkably durable, persisting in some forms into the early modern period and beyond. Collectors of folk sayings and proverbs in the 16th century recorded numerous expressions that referenced the famine years, many of which remained in active use centuries after their origins had been forgotten. A rat in hand is worth 2 in the walls, clearly derived from famine-era valuations, transforming the familiar proverb about birds and bushes into rat-specific form. Rain brings rats, rats bring bread, captures the strange causal chain of the famine economy, becoming a general expression about finding opportunity in adversity. From rat to riches emerged as a variant of rags to riches, specifically referencing families like Philippe's that had built wealth through rat commerce. These sayings, embedded in everyday language, kept alive some connection to the historical period, even as specific knowledge of events faded. The architectural legacy of the famine period was subtle but present for those who knew how to read it. Buildings constructed or renovated during the recovery years often incorporated features designed to facilitate drainage and air circulation, reflecting lessons learned during the years of persistent dampness. Granaries and storage buildings built after the famine included more sophisticated ventilation systems and moisture control measures, attempting to prevent the rot and mold that had destroyed so many stores during the crisis. Some structures included small architectural details that commemorated the period. Carved rats worked into decorative elements, inscriptions marking buildings that had served as collection points or processing facilities, foundation stones dated to the recovery years and marking the hope of new beginnings. These features, mostly noticed only by local people familiar with the history, created a landscape embedded with memory for those who could decode it. The generational transmission of trauma and resilience from the famine period followed complex patterns that psychologists and social historians would later find fascinating. Children who had been young during the famine often retained fragmented, confusing memories, images of rain, of hunger, of their parents' anxiety, of the smell of rendering fat, but without clear narrative or context. As they aged and had children of their own, they sometimes found these memories surfacing unexpectedly, triggered by rain or hunger or the sight of rats, creating emotional responses they struggled to explain. Grandchildren of famine survivors who had never experienced the crisis directly, nonetheless often absorbed attitudes and behaviors shaped by it. The food hoarding tendencies mentioned earlier, but also more subtle things like particular alertness to weather patterns, heightened attention to diversifying resources, appreciation for adaptability as a crucial virtue. This transmission of trauma-shaped worldviews across generations, largely unconscious and operating through socialization rather than explicit teaching, meant that the famine's psychological effects persisted long after direct memory had faded. The religious significance of the famine period and the rat economy remained theologically complex and somewhat controversial. Father Benedict's careful work in developing a framework for understanding the moral and spiritual dimensions had provided one approach, but other thinkers offered different interpretations. Some saw the famine as divine punishment for sins, the rat economy as a humiliating abasement that reflected God's judgment on a wayward people. Others interpreted it as a test of faith, the community's creative adaptation as an example of using God-given intelligence and resourcefulness to address challenges, the survival and recovery as evidence of divine providence working through human agency. Still others focused on the way the crisis had temporarily dissolved social hierarchies and created unusual equality of suffering and adaptation, seeing in this a reminder that all human distinctions were ultimately trivial before God. These competing theological interpretations coexisted uneasily, different preachers and thinkers emphasizing different aspects, depending on their particular theological commitments and rhetorical purposes. The educational institutions that developed in the region during the late 14th and 15th centuries incorporated the famine period into their curricula in sophisticated ways. A cathedral school established in 1384 included in its course of study an entire unit on economics in extremis, using the rat economy as the primary case study for teaching principles of value, exchange, monetary theory, and market organization. Students would read Brother Anselm's Chronicles, study the preserved ledgers from Lucian's office, and engage in hypothetical exercises, imagining how they might respond to similar crises involving different resources. This pedagogical approach, treating the historical crisis as a rich source of lessons applicable to broader understanding, rather than simply as a story to be memorized, represented sophisticated educational thinking for the period, and helped ensure that the intellectual legacy of the rat economy continued to influence new generations. The material culture that survived from the famine period became increasingly valuable to collectors and museums as time passed. The rat certificates, as mentioned, were sought after as historical curiosities. But other artifacts also gained significance. Trap mechanisms preserved from the famine years, examples of rat pelt leather goods, even some of the rendering pots that Aldrich and others had used to process rat fat. In the 16th century, a small museum established by a wealthy merchant included a room dedicated to the famine period, displaying these artifacts along with reproductions of Margot's paintings and excerpts from Brother Anselm's chronicles. The museum's presentation framed the period as an example of human resilience and ingenuity in the face of catastrophe, a source of regional pride, despite the undeniable suffering it represented. Visitors from other areas often found the exhibit both fascinating and disturbing, struggling to reconcile the desperate realities it depicted with their own comfortable circumstances. The question of how to appropriately memorialize and honor those who had died during the famine remained sensitive and complex. Baron Thibault's monument had listed names, but the inscriptions necessarily omitted details about how people had died, the slow starvation or disease or other specific causes. Some families maintained their own private memorials, graves marked with stones bearing dates from the famine years, household shrines remembering lost children or spouses or parents. The church held annual memorial services, prayers for the departed souls of famine victims, but these observances had to balance acknowledgement of suffering with emphasis on recovery and gratitude for survival. The survivors sometimes felt torn between wanting to honor those who had died and wanting to move forward without dwelling on loss, between remembering the pain and celebrating what had been achieved. This tension never fully resolved, different individuals and families finding their own ways to hold both mourning and resilience together. As the 15th century progressed and the famine period receded further into the past, the region's identity continued to be shaped by that history in subtle ways. Towns that had been central to the rat economy during the crisis often retained economic prominence afterward. The commercial networks and infrastructure established during the famine persisting and evolving to support normal trade. Families associated with innovation during the crisis, like Philippe's merchant dynasty, like Aldrich's descendants who continued as prominent bakers, like the lineages of skilled craftspeople who had developed rat leather techniques, often maintained elevated social and economic positions. The region developed a reputation for commercial innovation and adaptability that attracted enterprising individuals from elsewhere, creating a somewhat more dynamic and entrepreneurial culture than prevailed in neighboring areas. Whether this reputation was fully deserved or was partially self-fulfilling prophecy remains debatable, but the connection to the famine experience was consistently invoked as explanation for the region's character. The technological and methodological innovations that had emerged during the famine period sometimes found applications in completely different contexts. The systematic trapping techniques developed for efficiently harvesting rats proved useful for controlling other pest populations and for hunting small game. The quality grading and standardization approaches pioneered by Lucian influenced how other commodities were evaluated and traded, bringing greater consistency and efficiency to markets. The certificate system, which had allowed rats to be deposited and claims to be traded, provided a model for early forms of warehouse receipts and commodity futures that would become important in later commercial development. These transfers of technique and approach from the extreme crisis context to normal economic operations represented another way the famine period influenced the region's long-term trajectory, embedding innovations born of desperation into standard practice. The literature and poetry of the late 14th and 15th centuries produced in the region often incorporated references to the famine and rat economy as metaphors and symbolic elements. A poet named Guillaume, writing in the 1420s, produced a lengthy allegorical work titled The Transmutation of Value that used the rat economy as an extended metaphor for spiritual transformation, drawing parallels between the way desperation revealed unexpected worth in despised rodents and the way divine grace revealed unexpected worth in sinful human beings. While the allegory was sometimes strained and the theology questionable, the work demonstrated how deeply the rat economy had penetrated cultural consciousness, becoming available as a symbolic resource for exploring other ideas and themes. Other writers used famine period elements more straightforwardly, setting stories during the crisis, using characters' responses to the rat economy as ways of revealing their moral character, making the historical period a setting that readers found compelling and meaningful. The practical knowledge about rats themselves, their behavior, biology, and ecology that had been accumulated during the intensive harvesting period found some scientific application as European natural philosophy began developing more systematic approaches to studying the natural world. Scholars interested in animal behavior could consult records from the famine period documenting rat population dynamics, breeding patterns, response to different control methods, and variations between individual animals and populations. This information, collected for entirely practical rather than scientific purposes, nonetheless represented systematic observation of a sort that was relatively rare in medieval natural history. A natural philosopher writing in the 1500s explicitly cited famine period records in a treatise on rodents, using the data to support arguments about animal intelligence and adaptability. The connection between desperate survival practices and early scientific methodology exemplified how knowledge accumulated in one context could prove valuable in quite different ways than originally intended. The economic prosperity that characterized the region in the 15th century, as Europe recovered from the combined devastations of famine and plague, was built partly on the foundations laid during and immediately after the crisis years. The infrastructure investments Baron Thibault had funded, the commercial networks Philippe and others had established, the diversified economic activities that had developed as people sought multiple income sources. All of these contributed to the region's relative success in the recovering European economy. Merchants from the region developed a reputation for reliability and adaptability, for being willing to handle unusual goods and create innovative trading arrangements, characteristics that traced back to the famine period's demands for flexibility and creativity. Agricultural productivity benefited from the drainage improvements and diversification practices that had been implemented during the recovery. The population, while still below pre-famine levels, was growing, and the mix of residents included enterprising individuals attracted by the region's opportunities. The prosperity seemed to validate the pain and struggle of the famine years, offering some justification for the suffering, though survivors questioned whether any amount of subsequent success truly balanced the loss and trauma they had endured. The Festival of Plenty evolved in the late 15th century to incorporate theatrical performances of increasing sophistication and complexity. Professional acting companies began to develop, performing not just at the annual festival, but also traveling to other communities to present their dramatizations of the famine period. These performances, while still rooted in the historical events, increasingly took artistic liberties, embellishing characters and adding dramatic elements that had no basis in recorded history. Aldrich the baker became a heroic figure of nearly mythical status in some versions, his decision to accept rats portrayed as a moment of divine inspiration rather than desperate improvisation. Philippe the merchant was sometimes portrayed as a clever trickster figure, other times as a wise and benevolent organizer, depending on the particular theatrical interpretation. Baron Thibault's role varied from production to production, sometimes emphasized as crucial leadership, sometimes minimized to focus on the common people's adaptation. These varying interpretations reflected not just artistic choice, but also different understandings of what the famine period meant and what lessons should be drawn from it. Father Benedict's theological writings on the famine period, which had circulated primarily among educated clergy during his lifetime, found wider audiences in the 15th century as literacy expanded and printing technology began to emerge. His framework for thinking about necessity, dignity, and divine providence during extreme crises resonated with people facing different sorts of challenges in their own times. The text was copied, excerpted, commented upon, and gradually became recognized as a significant contribution to moral theology. A printed edition produced in 1496 introduced his work to international scholarly audiences, and theologians from across Europe began engaging with his arguments. This wider reception transformed the rat economy period from a localized historical curiosity into a case study with broader theological and philosophical significance. Father Benedict's careful thinking about the experience ensuring that it contributed to larger intellectual traditions. The descendants of those who had lived through the famine maintained varying relationships to that history. Some embraced it, researching their family's specific experiences, preserving letters and records, taking pride in how their ancestors had survived and adapted. Others preferred not to dwell on a period associated with such degradation and suffering, focusing instead on their family's achievements in better times. Some felt ambivalent, recognizing both the remarkable nature of what had been accomplished and the disturbing circumstances that had necessitated it. Family histories recorded in the 15th and 16th centuries reflected these varied attitudes, some including extensive accounts of famine-era experiences, while others mentioned the period only briefly before moving on to happier subjects. The diversity of responses suggested that there was no single correct way to relate to this difficult history, that different families and individuals legitimately processed and integrated the legacy in different ways. The centuries rolled forward, and the Great Famine of 1315 through 1317 gradually transformed from living memory into history, from history into legend, and from legend into the symbolic foundation of regional identity. By the 17th century, when scholars attempted to separate fact from embellishment in the accounts of the rat economy, they found the task nearly impossible. The preserved records existed: Lucian's careful ledgers, Brother Anselm's chronicles, Father Benedict's theological reflections. But they seemed almost too extraordinary to be entirely believed, even as their detail and consistency argued for their authenticity. What endured, beyond the specific facts and dates, was something more fundamental: the understanding that value itself was not fixed or inherent, but created by human need and collective agreement. The people who had lived through the famine years had discovered this truth in the most visceral way imaginable, watching as coins became meaningless and rats became precious, experiencing firsthand how completely economic structures could transform when circumstances demanded it. This insight, born of desperation and starvation, carried forward through generations as a kind of practical wisdom about the nature of money, markets, and human adaptation. The monument in the village square, worn by centuries of weather but still standing, continued to draw visitors who would trace their fingers over the carved rat surrounded by wheat, puzzling over the Latin inscription about desperation and innovation. Parents brought their children there, telling simplified versions of the story. When your great-great-great-grandparents were young, there was no food, and people had to eat rats to survive. But they were clever about it. They organized and cooperated, and they made it through. The children would wrinkle their noses at the thought of eating rats, just as children had done for generations, but they absorbed the deeper lesson that their ancestors had faced impossible circumstances and found ways to persist. As the modern era approached, the rat economy period became a favorite subject for economic historians studying the social construction of value and the emergence of monetary systems. Universities included it in courses on economic theory, using it as a vivid example of how currency could be based on any scarce resource that people agreed upon. The certificates that had circulated as paper money backed by deposits of rats were studied as early forms of financial instruments, primitive but functional ancestors of modern banking practices. The story appeared in textbooks, often accompanied by reproductions of Margot's paintings or photographs of the surviving monuments and artifacts. Yet something essential was always lost in these academic treatments, some quality of the actual experience that could not be reduced to economic principles or historical data. The cold that had seeped into bones during the endless rains, the hollow ache of prolonged hunger, the psychological toll of having to see vermin as food, the strange mixture of shame and pride in trading rats for bread, the fierce determination to survive no matter what it required. These textures of lived experience faded from the collective memory, even as the basic facts remained documented. In the quiet hours of evening, when the last light faded from the sky and shadows lengthened across the old village square, one could almost imagine the ghosts of that desperate time. Aldrich measuring out his flour with trembling hands, Godfrey arriving with his first catch of rats, Philippe organizing his collection networks, Baron Thibault wrestling with decisions about how to respond to the unprecedented crisis, Father Benedict praying for wisdom to guide his flock through moral ambiguities that had no clear answers. They had done what they had to do, these people from centuries past. They had adapted and innovated and survived, creating from the most unpromising materials an economy that functioned when everything else had failed. And in the end, that was the story's gift to the future. Not just the historical curiosity of rats as currency, but the deeper truth that human beings possessed remarkable capacities for adaptation when pressed to the limits. That when established systems failed, people could create new ones. That value was not inherent but created through need and agreement. That dignity could be maintained even in undignified circumstances through mutual support and determined effort. That survival itself was an achievement worth honoring, even when the means of survival seemed shameful by the standards of easier times. The rain had eventually stopped falling. The harvests had returned. The rats had gone back to being pests rather than precious resources. The people had gradually rebuilt their lives, their prosperity, their sense of normalcy. But they never forgot entirely what they had learned during those years when the world turned upside down, and the smallest, most despised creatures became the foundation of an economy and the means of survival. And so the story lived on, passed down through the generations, preserved in records and monuments and folk sayings and collective memory, a reminder that nothing was quite as fixed or permanent as it seemed, that crisis revealed capacities no one knew they possessed, and that sometimes the most unlikely sources held the key to survival. As you drift toward sleep tonight, perhaps you carry with you this strange and true story from medieval Europe, a tale of hunger and adaptation, of rats and redemption, of how desperate people reimagined everything they thought they knew about value and exchange and money itself. May it remind you that you, too, possess depths of resourcefulness you may never need to discover, but that lie ready within you nonetheless, waiting for any moment when ordinary approaches prove insufficient and extraordinary adaptation becomes necessary. Rest well, knowing that human ingenuity has faced seemingly impossible challenges before and found ways through. The medieval villagers who survived on rats and resilience would want you to know that you, too, can survive what must be survived, adapt to what must be adapted to, and find value in the most unexpected places when circumstances demand it. Good night.